An address by Beria. American students at the Lenin University, I welcome your attendance at these classes on psychopolitics. Psychopolitics is an important, if less known, division of geopolitics. It is less known because it must necessarily deal with highly educated personnel, the very top strata of mental healing. By psychopolitics, our chief goals are effectively carried forward. To produce a maximum of chaos in the culture of the enemy is our first most important step. Our fruits are grown in chaos. Distrust, economic, our first most important step. Our fruits are grown in chaos, distrust, economic depression, and scientific turmoil. At least a weary populace can seek peace only in our offered communist state. At last, only communism can resolve the problems of the masses. A psychopolitician must work hard to produce the maximum chaos in the fields of mental healing. He must recruit and use all the agencies and facilities of mental healing. He must labor to increase the personnel and facilities of, quote, mental healing, unquote, until at last the entire field of mental science is entirely dominated by communist principles and desires. To achieve these goals, the psychopolitician must crush every homegrown variety of mental healing in America. Actual teachings of James, Eddy, and Pentecostal Bible faith healers amongst your misguided people must be swept aside. They must be discredited, defamed, arrested, stamped upon even by their own government until there is no credit in them and only communist-oriented healing remains. You must work until every teacher of psychology unknowingly or knowingly teaches only communist doctrine under the guise of psychology. You must labor until every doctor and psychiatrist is either a psychopolitician or an unwitting assistant to our aims. You must labor until we have dominion over the minds and bodies of every important person in your nation. You must achieve such disrepute for the state of insanity and such authority over its pronouncement that not one statesman so labeled could again be given credence by his people. You must work until suicide arising from mental imbalance is common and calls forth no general investigation or remark. With the institutions for the insane you have in your country prisons which can hold 1 million persons and can hold them without civil rights or any hope of freedom. And upon these people can be practiced shock and surgery so that never again will they draw a sane breath. You must make these treatments common and accepted, and you must sweep aside any treatment or any group of persons seeking to treat by effective means. You must dominate as respected men the fields of psychiatry and psychology. You must dominate the hospitals and universities. You must carry forward the myth that only a European doctor is competent in the field of insanity, and thus excuse amongst you the high incidence of foreign birth and training. If and when we seize Vienna, you shall have then a common ground of meeting and can come and take your instructions as worshippers. Psychopolitics is a solemn charge. With it you can erase our enemies as insects. Psychopolitics is a solemn charge. With it you can erase our enemies as insects. You can cripple the efficiency of leaders by striking insanity into their families through the use of drugs. You can wipe them away with testimony as to their insanity. By our technologies you can even bring about insanity itself when they seem too resistive. You can change their loyalties by psychopolitics. Given a short time with a psychopolitician, you can alter forever the loyalty of a soldier in our hands, or a statesman or a leader in his own country, or you can destroy his mind. However, you labor under certain dangers. It may happen that remedies for our treatments may be discovered. It may occur that a public hue and cry may arise against mental healing. It may thus occur that all mental healing might be placed in the hands of ministers and be taken out of the hands of our psychologists and psychiatrists. But the capitalistic thirst for control, capitalistic inhumanity, and a general public terror of insanity can be brought to guard against these things. But should they occur, should independent researchers actually discover means to undo psychopolitical procedures, you must not rest, you must not eat or sleep, you must not stint one tiniest bit of available money to campaign against it, discredit it, strike it down, and render it void. For by an effective means all our actions and researches could be undone. In a capitalistic state, you are aided on all sides by the corruption of the philosophy of man and the times. You will discover that everything will aid you in your campaign to seize, control, and use all mental healing to spread our doctrine and rid us of our enemies within their own borders. Use the courts, use the judges, use the constitution of the country, use its medical societies and its laws to further our ends. Do not stint in your labor in this direction. And when you have succeeded, you will discover that you can now effect your own legislation at will, and you can, by careful organization of healing societies, by constant campaigns about the terrors of society, by pretense as to your effectiveness, make your capitalist himself, by his own appropriations, finance a large portion of the quiet communist conquest of the nation. By psychopolitics, create chaos. Leave a nation leaderless. Kill our enemies. By psychopolitics, create chaos. Leave a nation leaderless. Kill our enemies, and bring to earth, through communism, the greatest peace man has ever known. Thank you. Chapter 1. The History and Definition of Psychopolitics. Although punishment for its own sake may not be entirely without recompense, it is nevertheless true that the end and goal of all punishment is the indoctrination of the person being punished with an idea, whether that idea be one of restraint or obedience. In that any ruler has, from time beyond memory, needed the obedience of his subjects in order to accomplish his ends, he has thus resorted to punishment. This is true of every tribe and state in the history of man. Today, Russian culture has evolved more certain and definite methods of aligning and securing the loyalties of persons and populaces, and of enforcing obedience upon them. This modern outgrowth of old practice is called psychopolitics. The stupidity and narrowness of nations not blessed with Russian reasoning has caused them to rely upon practices which are, today, too ancient and outmoded for the rapid and heroic pace of our time. And in view of the tremendous advance of Russian culture in the field of mental technologies, begun with the glorious work of Pavlov and carried forward so ably by later Russians, it would be strange that an art and science would not evolve totally devoted to the aligning of loyalties and extracting the obedience of individuals and multitudes. Thus we see that psychopolitical procedures are a natural outgrowth of practices as old as man, practices which are current in every group of men throughout the world. Thus, in psychopolitical procedures, there is no ethical problem, since it is obvious and evident that man is always coerced against his will to the greater good of the state, whether by economic gains or indoctrination into the wishes and desires of the state. Basically, man is an animal. He is an animal which has been given a civilized veneer. Man is a collective animal grouped together for his own protection before the threat of the environment. Those who so group and control him must then have in their possession specialized techniques to direct the vagaries and energies of the animal man toward greater efficiency in the accomplishment of the goals of the state. Psychopolitics in one form or another have long been used in Russia, but the subject is all but unknown outside the borders of our nation, save only where we have carefully transplanted our information and where it is used for the greater good of the nation. The definition of psychopolitics follows. Psychopolitics is the art and science of asserting and maintaining dominion over the thoughts and loyalties of individuals, officers, bureaus, and masses, and the effecting of the conquest of enemy nations through, quote, mental healing, unquote. The subject of psychopolitics breaks down into several categories, each a natural and logical proceeding from the last. Its first subject is the constitution and anatomy of man himself as a political organism. The next is an examination of man as an economic organism, as this might be controlled by his desires. The next is classification of state goals for the individual and masses. The next is an examination of loyalties. The next is the general subject of obedience. The next is the anatomy of the stimulus response mechanisms of man. The next is the subjects of shock and endurance. The next is categories of experience. The next is the catalyzing and aligning of experience. The next is the use of drugs. The next is the use of implantation. The next is the general application of psychopolitics within Russia. The next is the organization and use of counter-psychopolitics. The next is the use of psychopolitics in the conquest of foreign nations. The next is psychopolitical organizations outside Russia, their composition and activity. The next is the creation of slave philosophy in an hostile nation. The next is countering anti-psychopolitical activities abroad, and the final one, the destiny of psychopolitical rule in a scientific age. To this might be added many subcategories, such as the nullification of modern weapons by psychopolitical activity. The strength and power of psychopolitics cannot be overestimated, particularly when used in a nation decayed by pseudo-intellectualism, where exploitation of the masses combines readily with psychopolitical actions, and particularly where the greed of capitalistic or monarchical regimes has already brought about an overwhelming incidence of neurosis, which can be employed as the groundwork for psychopolitical action and a psychopolitical core. It is part of your mission, student, to prevent psychopolitical activity to the detriment of the Russian state, just as it is your mission to carry forward in our nation and outside it, if you are so assigned, the missions and goals of psychopolitics. No agent of Russia could be even remotely effective without a thorough grounding in psychopolitics, and so you carry forward with you a Russian trust to use well what you are learning here. Chapter 2. The Constitution of Man as a Political Organism. Man is already a colonial aggregation of cells, and to consider him an individual would be an error. Colonies of cells have gathered together as one organ or another of the body, and then these organs have, themselves, gathered together to form the whole. Thus we see that man himself is already a political organism, even if we do not consider a mass of men. Sickness could be considered to be a disloyalty to the remaining organisms on the part of one organism. This disloyalty, becoming apparent, brings about a revolt of some part of the anatomy against the remaining whole, and thus we have, in effect, an internal revolution. The heart, becoming disaffected, falls away from close membership and service to the remainder of the organism, and we discover the entire body and all of its activities is disrupted because of the revolutionary activity of the heart. The heart is in revolt because it cannot or will not cooperate with the remainder of the body. If we permit the heart thus to revolt, the kidneys, taking the example of the heart, may in their turn rebel and cease to work for the good of the organism. This rebellion, multiplying to other organs and the glandular system, brings about the death of the individual, unquote. We can see with ease that the revolt is death, that the revolt of any part of the organism results in death. Thus we see that there can be no compromise with rebellion. Like the individual, unquote, man, the state is a collection of aggregations. The political entities within the state must, all of them, cooperate for the greater good of the state, lest the state itself fall asunder and die, for with the disaffection of any single distrust we discover an example set for other districts, and we discover at length the entire state falling. This is the danger of revolution. Look at Earth. We see here one entire organism. The organism of Earth is an individual organism. Earth has as its organs the various races and nations of men. Where one of these is permitted to remain disaffected, Earth itself is threatened with death. The threatened rebellion of one country, no matter how small, against the total organism of Earth would find Earth sick and the cultural state of man to suffer in consequence. Thus, the putrescent illness of capitalist states, spreading their pus and bacteria into the healthy countries of the world, would not do otherwise than bring about the death of Earth, unless these ill organisms are brought into loyalty and obedience and made to function for the greater good of the worldwide state. That is the New World Order that the powers that be are moving us toward. The globalist New World Order. The constitution of man is so composed that the individual cannot function efficiently without the alignment of each and every part and organ of his anatomy, as the average individual is incapable in an unformed and uncultured state, as witness the barbarians of the jungle. So must he be trained into a coordination of his organic functions by exercise, education, and work towards specific goals. We particularly and specifically note that the individual must be directed from without to accomplish his exercise, education, and work. He must be made to realize this, for only then can he be made to function efficiently in the role assigned to him. The tenets of rugged individualism, personal determination, self-will, imagination, and personal creativeness are alike in the masses antipathetic to the good of the greater state. These willful and unaligned forces are no more than illnesses which will bring about disaffection, disunity, and at length the collapse of the group to which the individual is attached. The constitution of man lends itself easily and thoroughly to certain and positive regulation from without of all of its functions, including those of thinkingness, obedience, and loyalty, and these things must be controlled if a greater state is to ensue. While it may seem desirable to the surgeon to amputate one or another limb or organ in order to save the remainder, it must be pointed out that this expediency is not entirely possible of accomplishment where one considers entire nations. A body deprived of organs can be observed to be lessened in its effectiveness. The world deprived of the workers, now enslaved by the insane and nonsensical idiocies of the capitalists and monarchs of Earth, would, if removed, create a certain disability in the worldwide state. Just as we see the victor forced to rehabilitate the population of a conquered country at the end of a war, Thus, any effort to depopulate a disaffected portion of the world might have some consequence. However, let us consider the inroad of virus and bacteria hostile to the organism, and we see that unless we can conquer the germ, the organ or organism which it is attacking will itself suffer. In any state, we have certain individuals who operate in the role of the virus and germ, and these, attacking the population or any group within the population, produce, by their self-willed greed, a sickness in the organ, which then generally spreads to the whole. The constitution of man as an individual body, or the constitution of a state or a portion of the state as a political organism, are analogous. It is the mission of psychopolitics first to align the obedience and goals of the group, and then maintain their alignment by the eradication of the effectiveness of the persons and personalities which might swerve the group toward disaffection. In our own nation, where things are better managed and where reason reigns above all else, it is not difficult to eradicate the self-willed bacteria which might attack one of our political entities. But in the field of conquest, in nations less enlightened, where the Russian state does not yet have power, it is not as feasible to remove the entire self-willed individual. Psychopolitics makes it possible to remove that part of his personality which in itself is making havoc with the person's own constitution, as well as the group with which the person is connected. If the animal man were permitted to continue undisturbed by counter-revolutionary propaganda, if he were left to work under the well-planned management of the state, we would discover little sickness amongst man, and we would discover no sickness in the state. But where the individual is troubled by conflicting propaganda, where he is made the effect of revolutionary activities, where he is permitted to think thoughts critical of the state itself, where he is permitted to question of those in whose natural charge he falls, we would discover his constitution to suffer. We would discover from this disaffection the additional disaffection of his heart and of other portions of his anatomy. So certain is this principle that when one finds a sick individual, could one search deeply enough, he would discover a misaligned loyalty and an interrupted obedience to that person's group unit. There are those who foolishly have embarked upon some spiritual Alice in Wonderland voyage into what they call the subconscious or the unconscious mind, and who under the guise of psychotherapy would seek to make well the disaffection of body organs, but it is to be noted that their results are singularly lacking in success. There is no strength in such an approach. When hypnotism was first invented in Russia, it was observed that all that was necessary was to command the unresisting individual to be well in order many times to accomplish that fact. The limitation of hypnotism was that many subjects were not susceptible to its uses, and thus hypnotism has had to be improved upon in order to increase the suggestibility of individuals who would not otherwise be reached. Thus, any nation has had the experience of growing well again as a whole organism when placing sufficient force in play against a disaffected group. Just as in hypnotism any organ can be commanded into greater loyalty and obedience, so can any political group be commanded into greater loyalty and obedience should sufficient force be employed. However, force often brings about destruction, and it is occasionally not feasible to use broad mass force to accomplish the ends in view. Thus it is necessary to align the individual against his desire not to conform. Just as it is a recognized truth that man must conform to his environment, so it is a recognized truth, and will become more so as the years proceed, that even the body of man can be commanded into health. The constitution of man renders itself peculiarly adapted to realignment of loyalties. Where these loyalties are indigestible to the constitution of the individual itself, such as loyalties to the petite bourgeoisie, the capitalist, to anti-Russian ideas, we find the individual body peculiarly susceptible to sickness, and thus we can clearly understand the epidemics, illnesses, mass neuroses, tumults and confusions of the untied states and other capitalist countries. Here we find the worker improperly and incorrectly loyal, and thus we find the worker ill. To save him and establish him properly upon his goal toward a greater state, it is an overpowering necessity to make it possible for him to grant this loyalties in a correct direction, in that his loyalties are swerved and his obedience cravenly demanded by persons antipathetic to his general good, and in that these persons are few, even in a capitalist nation, the goal and direction of psychopolitics is clearly understood. To benefit the worker in such a plight, it is necessary to eradicate, by general propaganda, by other means and by his own cooperation with the environment, and thus to ensure to the worker less warped leadership, less craven doctrine, and more cooperation with the ideas and ideals of the communist state. The technologies of psychopolitics are directed to this end. Chapter 3. Man as an economic organism. Man is subject to certain desires and needs which are as natural to his beingness as they are to that of any other animal. Man, however, has the peculiarity of exaggerating some of these beyond the bounds of reason. This is obvious through the growth of leisure classes, pseudo-intellectual groups, the petite bourgeoisie, capitalism, and other ills. It has been said with truth that 1/10 of a man's life is concerned with politics and 9/10 with economics. Without food, the individual dies. Without clothing, he freezes. Without houses and weapons, he is prey to the starving wolves. The acquisition of sufficient items to answer these necessities of food, clothing, and shelter in reason is the natural right of a member of an enlightened state. An excess of such items brings about unrest and disquiet. The presence of luxury items and materials, and the artificial creation and whetting of appetites, as in capitalist advertising, are certain to accentuate the less desirable characteristics of man. The individual is an economic organism in that he requires a certain amount of food, a certain amount of water, and must hold within himself a certain amount of heat in order to live. When he has more food than he can eat, more clothing than he needs to protect him, he then enters upon a certain idleness which dulls his wits and awareness, and makes him prey to difficulties which, in a less toxic state, he would have foreseen and avoided. Thus we have a glut being a menace to the individual. It is no less different in a group. Where the group acquires too much, its awareness of its own fellows and of the environment is accordingly reduced, and the effectiveness of the group in general is lost. The maintaining of a balance between gluttony and need is the province of economics proper, and is the fit subject and concern of the communist state. Desire and want are a state of mind. Individuals can be educated into desiring and wanting more than they can ever possibly attain, and such individuals are unhappy. Most of the self-willed characteristics of the capitalists come entirely from greed. He exploits the worker far beyond any necessity on his own part, as a capitalist, to need. In a nation where economic balances are not controlled, the appetite of the individual is unduly whetted by enchanting and fanciful persuasions to desire, and a type of insanity ensues where each individual is persuaded to possess more than he can use, and to possess it even at the expense of his fellows. There is in economic balances the other side. Too great and too long privation can bring about unhealthy desires, which in themselves accumulate if left action more than the individual can use. Poverty itself, as carefully cultivated in capitalist states, can bring about an imbalance of acquisition. Just as a vacuum will pull into it masses, in a country where forced privation upon the masses is permitted and where desire is artificially whetted, need turns to greed, and one easily discovers in such states exploitation of the many for the benefit of the few. If one, by the techniques of psychopolitics, were to dull this excessive greed in the few who possess it, the worker would be freed to seek a more natural balance. Here we have two extremes. Either one of them are an insanity. If we wish to create an insanity, we need only glut or deprive an individual at long length beyond the ability to withstand, and we have a mental imbalance. A simple example of this is the alternation of too low with too high pressures in a chamber, an excellent psychopolitical procedure. The rapidly varied pressure brings about a chaos wherein the individual will cannot act and where other wills then perforce assume control. Essentially, in an entire country, one must remove the greedy by whatever means and must then create and continue a semi-privation in the masses in order to command and utterly control the nation. A continuous hope for prosperity must be indoctrinated into the masses with many dreams and visions of glut, of commodity, and this hope must be counterplayed against the actuality of privation and the continuous threat of loss of all economic factors in case of disloyalty to the state in order to suppress the individual wills of the masses. In a nation under conquest, such as America, our slow and stealthy approach need take advantage only of the cycles of booms and depressions inherent in capitalistic nations in order to assert more and more strong control over individual wills. A boom is as advantageous as a depression for our ends. For during prosperity, our propaganda lines must only continue to point up the wealth the period is delivering to the selected few to divorce their control of the state. During a depression, one must only point out that it ensued as a result of the avarice of a few and the general political incompetence of the national leaders. The handling of economic propaganda is not properly the sphere of psychopolitics, but the psychopolitician must understand economic measures and communist goals connected with them. The masses must at last come to believe that only excessive taxation of the rich can relieve them of the burdensome leisure class, and can thus be brought to accept such a thing as income tax, a Marxist principle smoothly slid into capitalistic framework in 1909 in the United States. This, even though the basic law of the United States forbade it, and even though communism at that time had been active only a few years in America. Such success as the income tax law, had it been followed thoroughly, could have brought the United States and not Russia into the world scene as the first communist nation. But the virility and good sense of the Russian peoples won. It may not be that the United States will become entirely communist until past the middle of the century, but when it does, it will be because of our superior understanding of economics and of psychopolitics. The communist agent skilled in economics has as his task the suborning of tax agencies and their personnel to create the maximum disturbance and chaos and the passing of laws adapted to our purposes. And to him we must leave this task. The psychopolitical operator plays a distinctly different role in this drama. The rich, the skilled in finance, the well-informed in government are particular and individual targets for the psychopolitician. His is the role of taking off the board those individuals who would halt or corrupt communist economic programs. Thus, every rich man, every statesman, every person well informed and capable in government must have brought to his side as a trusted confidant a psychopolitical operator. The families of these persons are often deranged from idleness and glut, and this fact must be played upon even created. The normal health and wildness of a rich man's son must be twisted and perverted and explained into neurosis, and then, assisted by a timely administration of drugs or violence, turned into criminality or insanity. This brings at once someone in mental healing, unquote, into confidential contact with the family, and from this point on the very most must then be made of that contact. Communism could best succeed if at the side of every rich or influential man there could be placed a psychopolitical operator. an undoubted authority in the field of, quote, mental healing, unquote, who could then, by his advice or through the medium of a wife or daughter, by his guided opinions, direct the optimum policy to embroil or upset the economic policies of the country and, when the time comes to do away forever with the rich or influential man, to administer the proper drug or treatment to bring about his complete demise in an institution as a patient or dead as a suicide. Planted beside a country's powerful persons, the psychopolitical operator can also guide other policies to the betterment of our battle. The capitalist does not know the definition of war. He thinks of war as attack with force performed by soldiers and machines. He does not know that a more effective, if somewhat longer war can be fought with bread or, in our case, with drugs and the wisdom of our art. The capitalist has never won a war in truth. The psychopolitician is having little trouble winning this one. Chapter 4. State Goals for the Individual and Masses. Just as we would discover an individual to be ill whose organs, each one, had a different goal from the rest, so we discover the individuals in the state to be ill where goals are not rigorously codified and enforced. There are those who, in less enlightened times, gave man to believe that goals should be personally sought and held, and that indeed man's entire impulse toward higher things stemmed from freedom. We must remember that the same peoples who embraced this philosophy also continued in Man, the Myth of Spiritual Existence. All goals proceed from duress. Life is a continuous escape. Without force and threat there can be no striving. Without pain there can be no desire to escape from pain. Without the threat of punishment there can be no gain. Without duress and command there can be no alignment of bodily functions. Without rigorous and forthright control, there can be no accomplished goals for the state. Goals of the state should be formulated by the state for the obedience and concurrence of the individuals within that state. A state without goals so formulated is a sick state. A state without the power and forthright wish to enforce its goals is a sick state. When an order is issued by the communist state and is not obeyed, a sickness will be discovered to ensue. Where obedience fails, the masses suffer. State goals depend upon loyalty and obedience for their accomplishment. When one discovers a state goal to be interpreted, one discovers inevitably that there has been an interposition of self-willedness, of greed, of idleness, or of rugged individualism and self-centered initiative. The interruption of a state goal will be discovered as having been interrupted by a person whose disloyalty and disobedience is the direct result of his own misalignment with life. It is not always necessary to remove the individual. It is possible to remove his self-willed tendencies to the improvement of the goals and gains of the whole. The technologies of psychopolitics are graduated upon the scale, which starts somewhat above the removal of the individual himself, upward toward the removal only of those tendencies which bring about his lack of cooperation. It is not enough for the state to have goals. These goals, once put forward, depend for their completion upon the loyalty and obedience of the workers. These, engaged for the most part in hard labors, have little time for idle speculation, which is good. But above them, unfortunately, there must be foremen of one or another position, any one of whom might have sufficient idleness and lack of physical occupation to cause some disaffecting independency in his conduct and behavior. Psychopolitics remedies this tendency towards disaffection when it exceeds the common persuasions of the immediate superiors of the person in question. Chapter 5. an examination of loyalties. If loyalty is so important in the economic and social structure, it is necessary to examine it further in itself. In the field of psychopolitics, loyalty means simply alignment. It means more fully alignment with the goals of the communist state. Disloyalty means entirely misalignment, and more broadly, misalignment with the goals of the communist state. When we consider that the goals of the communist state are to the best possible benefit of the masses, we can see that disloyalty, as a term, can embrace democratic alignment. Loyalty to persons not communistically indoctrinated would be quite plainly a misalignment. The cure of disloyalty is entirely contained in the principles of alignment. All that it is necessary to do where disloyalty is encountered is to align the purposes of the individual toward the goals of communism, and it will be discovered that a great many circumstances hitherto distasteful in his existence will cease to exist. A heart or a kidney in rebellion against the remainder of the organism is being disloyal to the remainder of the organism. To cure that heart or kidney is actually only necessary to bring its activities into alignment with the remainder of the body. The technologies of psychopolitics adequately demonstrate the workability of this. Mild shock of the electric variety can and does produce the recooperation of a rebellious body organ. It is the shock and punishment of surgery which, in the main, accomplishes the realignment of a disaffected portion of the body, rather than the surgery itself. It is the bombardment of X-rays, rather than the therapeutic value of X-rays, which causes some disaffected organ to once again turn its attention to the support of the general organism. While it is not borne out that electric shock has any therapeutic value, so far as making the individual more sane, it is adequately brought out that its punishment value will create in the patient a greater cooperative attitude. Brain surgery has no statistical data to recommend it beyond its removal of the individual personality from amongst the paths of organs, which were not permitted to cooperate. These two Russian developments have never pretended to alter the state of sanity. They are only effective and workable in introducing an adequate punishment mechanism to the personality to make it cease and desist from its courses and egotistical direction of the anatomy itself. It is the violence of the electric shock and the surgery which are useful in subduing the recalcitrant personality, which is all that stands in the road of the masses or the state. It is occasionally to be discovered that the removal of the preventing personality by shock and surgery then permits the regrowth and reestablishment of organs which have been rebelled against by that personality. In that a well-regulated state is composed of organisms, not personalities, the use of electric shock and brain surgery in psychopolitics is clearly demonstrated. The changing of loyalty consists in its primary step of the eradication of existing loyalties. This can be done in one of two ways. First, by demonstrating that previously existing loyalties have brought about perilous physical circumstances such as imprisonment, lack of recognition, duress, or privation, and second, by eradicating the personality itself. The first is accomplished by a steady and continuous indoctrination of the individual in the belief that his previous loyalties have been granted to an unworthy source. One of the primary instances in this is creating circumstances which apparently derive from the target of his loyalties, so as to rebuff the individual. As part of this, there is the creation of a state of mind in the individual by actually placing him under duress, and then furnishing him with false evidence to demonstrate that the target of his previous loyalties is, itself, the cause of the distress, the course of the duress. Another portion of this same method consists of defaming or degrading the individual whose loyalties are to be Another portion of this same method consists of defaming or degrading the individual whose loyalties are to be changed to the target of his loyalties, i.e., superiors of government, to such a degree that this target, at length, actually does hold the individual in disrepute, and so does rebuff him and serve to convince him that his loyalties have been misplaced. These are the milder methods, but have proven extremely effective. The greatest drawback in their practices is that they require time and concentration, the manufacture of false evidence, and a psychopolitical operator's time. In moments of expediency, of which there are many, the personality itself can be rearranged by shock, surgery, duress, privation, and in particular that best of psychopolitical techniques, implantation. With the technologies of neo-hypnotism, such duress must have in its first part a defamation of the loyalties. A good and experienced psychopolitical operator working under the most favorable circumstances can, by the use of psychopolitical technologies, alter the loyalties of an individual so deftly that his own companions will not suspect that they have changed. This, however, requires considerably more finesse than is usually necessary to the situation. Mass neo-hypnotism can accomplish more or less the same results when guided by an experienced psychopolitical operator. An end goal in such a procedure would be the alteration of the loyalties of an entire nation in a short period of time by mass neo-hypnotism, a thing which has been effectively accomplished among the less usable states of Russia. It is adequately demonstrated that loyalty is entirely lacking in that mythical commodity known as spiritual quality. Loyalty is entirely a thing of dependence, economic or mental, and can be changed by the crudest implementations. Observation of workers in their factories or fields demonstrates that they easily grant loyalty to a foreman or a woman, and then as easily abandon it and substitute another individual, revulsing at the same time toward the person to whom loyalty was primarily granted. The queasy insecurity of the masses in capitalistic nations finds this more common than in an enlightened state such as Russia. In capitalistic states, dependencies are so craven, wants and privations are so exaggerated that loyalty is entirely without ethical foundation, and exists only in the realm of dependency, duress, or demand. It is fortunate that communism so truly approaches an ideal state of mind, for this brings a certain easiness into any changing of loyalties, since all other philosophies extant and practiced on earth today are degraded and debased compared to communism. It is then with a certain security that a psychopolitical operator functions, for he knows that he can change the loyalty of an individual to a more ideal level by reason alone, and only expediency makes it necessary to employ the various shifts of psychopolitical technology. Any man who cannot be persuaded into communist rationale is, of course, to be regarded as somewhat less than sane, and it is therefore completely justified to use the techniques of insanity upon the non-communist. In order to change loyalty, it is necessary to establish first the existing loyalties of the individual. The task is made very simple in view of the fact that capitalistic and fascistic nations have no great security in the loyalty of their subjects. And it may be found that the loyalties of the subjects, as we call any person against whom psychopolitical technology is to be exerted, are already too faint to require eradication. It is generally only necessary to persuade with the rationale and overwhelming reasonability of communism to have the person grant his loyalty to the Russian state. However, regulated only by the importance of the subject, no great amount of time should be expended upon the individual, but emotional duress or electric shock or brain surgery should be resorted to should communist propaganda persuasion fail. In a case of a very important person, it may be necessary to utilize the more delicate technologies of psychopolitics so as to place the person himself and his associates in ignorance of the operation. In this case, a simple implantation is used with a maximum duress and command value. Only the most skilled psychopolitical operators should be employed on such a project, as in this case of the very important person, for a bungling might disclose the tampering with his mental processes. It is much more highly recommended, if there is any doubt whatsoever about the success of an operation against an important person, to select out as a psychopolitical target persons in his vicinity in whom he is emotionally involved. His wife or children normally furnish the best targets, and these can be operated against without restraint. In securing the loyalty of a very important person, one must place at his side a constant pleader who enters a sexual or familial chord into the situation on the side of communism. It may not be necessary to make a communist out of the wife or the children or one of the children, but it might prove efficacious to do so. In most instances, however, this is not possible. By the use of various drugs, it is, in this modern age, and well within the realm of psychopolitical reality, entirely too easy to bring about a state of severe neurosis or insanity in the wife or children, and thus pass them, with full consent of the important person, and the government in which he exists, or the bureau in which he is operating, into the hands of a psychopolitical operator who then in his own laboratory, without restraint or fear of investigation or censor, can, with electric shock, surgery, sexual attack, drugs, or other useful means, degrade or entirely alter the personality of a family member and create in that person a psychopolitical slave subject who then, on command or signal, will perform outrageous actions, thus discrediting the important person, or will demand on a more delicate level that certain measures be taken by the important person, which measures are, of course, dictated by the psychopolitical operator. Usually when the party has no real interest in the activities or decisions of the important person, but merely wishes to remove him from effective action, the attention of the psychopolitical operator need not be so intense, and the person need only be passed into the hands of some unwitting mental practitioner who, taught as he is by psychopolitical operators, will bring about sufficient embarrassment. When the loyalty of an individual cannot be swerved, and where the opinion weight or effectiveness of the individual stands firmly in the road of communist goals, it is usually best to occasion a mild neurosis in the person by any available means, and then, having carefully given him a history of mental imbalance, to see to it that he disposes of himself by suicide, or by bringing about his demise in such a way as to resemble suicide. Psychopolitical operators have handled such situations skillfully tens of thousands of times within and without Russia. It is a firm principle of psychopolitics that the person to be destroyed must be involved first or second hand in the stigma of insanity, and must have been placed in contact with psychopolitical operators or persons trained by them with a maximum amount of tumult and publicity. The stigma of insanity is properly placed at the door of such persons' reputations and is held there firmly by bringing about irrational acts, either on his own part or in his vicinity. Such an activity can be classified as a partial destruction. As a partial destruction of alignment. And if this destruction is carried forward to its further extent, the misalignment on the subject of all loyalties can be considered to be complete, and alignment on new loyalties can be embarked upon safely. By bringing about insanity or suicide on the part of the wife of an important political personage, a sufficient misalignment has been instigated to change his attitude. And this, carried forward firmly or assisted by psychopolitical implantation, can begin the rebuilding of his loyalties, but now slanted in a more proper and fitting direction. Another reason for the alignment of psychological activities with the misalignment of insanity is that insanity itself is a despised and disgraced state, and anything connected with it is lightly viewed. Thus, a psychopolitical operator working in the vicinity of an insane person can refute and disprove any accusations made against him by demonstrating that the family itself is tainted with mental imbalance. This is surprisingly effective in capitalistic countries where insanity is so thoroughly feared that no one would dream of investigating any circumstances in its vicinity. Psychopolitical propaganda works constantly and must work constantly to increase and build up this aura of mystery surrounding insanity, and must emphasize the horribleness and hopelessness of insanity in order to excuse non-therapeutic actions taken against the insane. Particularly in capitalistic countries, an insane person may hold no rights under law. No person who is insane may testify. Thus, we have an excellent road along which we can travel toward our certain goal and destiny. Entirely by bringing about public conviction that the sanity of a person is in question, it is possible to discount and eradicate all of the goals and activities of that person. By demonstrating the insanity of a group or even a government, it is possible then to cause its people to disavow it. By magnifying the general human reaction to insanity, through keeping the subject of insanity itself before the public eye, and then by utilizing this reaction by causing a revulsion on the part of a populace against its leader or leaders, it is possible to stop any government or movement. It is important to know that the entire subject of loyalty is thus as easily handled as it is. One of the first and foremost missions of the psychopolitician is to make an attack upon communism and insanity synonymous. It should become the definition of insanity, the paranoid variety that, quote, a paranoid believes he is being attacked by communists, unquote. Thus, at once, the support of the individual so attacking communism will fall away and wither. Instead of executing national leaders, suicide for them should be arranged under circumstances which question their demise. In this way, we can select out all opposition to the communist extension into the social orders of the world and render populaces who would oppose us leaderless and bring about a state of chaos or misalignment into which we can thrust with great simplicity the clear and forceful doctrines of communism. The cleverness of our attack in this field of psychopolitics The cleverness of our attack in this field of psychopolitics is adequate to avoid the understanding of the layman and the usual stupid official, and by operating entirely under the banner of authority, with the oft-repeated statement that the principles of psychotherapy are too devious for common understanding, an entire revolution can be effected without the suspicion of a populace until it is an accomplished fact. As insanity is the maximum misalignment, it can be grasped to be the maximum weapon in severance of loyalties to leaders and old social orders. Thus, it is of the utmost importance that psychopolitical operatives infiltrate the healing arts of a nation marked for conquest and bring from that quarter continuous pressure against the population and the government until at last the conquest is effected. This is the subject and goal of psychopolitics itself. In rearranging loyalties, we must have a command of their values. In the animal, the first loyalty is to himself. This is destroyed by demonstrating errors to him, showing him that he does not remember, cannot act, or does not trust himself. The second loyalty is to his family unit, his parents and brothers and sisters. This is destroyed by making a family unit economically non-dependent, by lessening the value of marriage, by making an easiness of divorce, and by raising the children, wherever possible, by the state. The next loyalty is to his friends and local environment. This is destroyed by lowering his trust and bringing about reportings upon him allegedly by his fellows or the town or village authorities. The next is to the state, and this, for the purposes of communism, is the only loyalty which should exist once the state is founded as a communist state. To destroy loyalty to the state, all manner of forbiddings for youth must be put into effect so as to disenfranchise them as members of the capitalist state, and, by promise of a better lot under communism, to gain their loyalty to a communist movement. Denying a capitalist country easy access to courts, bringing about and supporting propaganda to destroy the home, creating and continuous juvenile delinquency, forcing upon the state all manner of practices to divorce the child from it, will in the end create the chaos necessary to communism. Under the saccharine guise of assistance to them, rigorous child labor laws are the best means to deny the child any right in the society. By refusing to let him earn, by forcing him into unwanted dependence upon a grudging parent, by making certain in other channels that the parent is never in other than economic stress, the child can be driven in his teens into revolt. Delinquency will ensue. By making readily available drugs of various kinds, by giving the teenager alcohol, by praising his wildness, by stimulating him with sex literature, and advertising to him or her practices as taught at the sex pole, the psychopolitical operator can create the necessary attitude of chaos, idleness, and worthlessness into which can then be cast the solution which will give the teenager complete freedom everywhere. Communism. Should it be possible to continue conscription beyond any reasonable time by promoting unpopular wars and other means, the draft can always stand as a further barrier to the progress of youth in life, destroying any immediate hope to participate in his nation's civil life. By these means, the patriotism of youth for their capitalistic flag can be dulled to a point where they are no longer dangerous as soldiers. While this might require many decades to effect, capitalism's short-term view will never envision the links across which we can plan. If we could effectively kill the national pride and patriotism of just one generation, we will have won that country. Therefore, there must be continual propaganda abroad to undermine the loyalty of the citizens in general and the teenager in particular. The role of the psychopolitical operator in this is very strong. He can, from his position as an authority on the mind, advise all manner of destructive measures. He can teach the lack of control of the child at home. He can instruct, in an optimum situation, the entire nation in how to handle children, and instruct them so that the children, given no control, given no real home, can run wildly about with no responsibility for their nation or themselves. The misalignment of the loyalty of youth to a capitalistic nation sets the proper stage for a realignment of their loyalties with communism. Creating a greed for drugs, sexual misbehavior, and uncontrolled freedom, and presenting this to them as a benefit of communism will with ease bring about our alignment. In the case of strong leaders amongst youthful groups, a psychopolitical operator can work in many ways to use or discard that leadership. If it is to be used, the character of the girl or boy must be altered carefully into criminal channels, and a control by blackmail or other means must be maintained. But where the leadership is not susceptible, where it resists all persuasions and might become dangerous to our cause, no pains must be spared to direct the attention of the authorities to that person and to harass him in one way or another until he can come into the hands of juvenile authorities. When this has been effected, it is hoped that a psychopolitical operator, by reason of child advisor status, can, in the security of the jail, and cloaked by processes of law, destroy the sanity of that person. Particularly brilliant scholars, athletes, and youth group leaders must be handled in either one of these two ways. In the matter of guiding the activities of the juvenile courts, the psychopolitical operator entertains here one of his easier tasks. A capitalistic nation is so filled with injustice in general that a little more passes without comment. In juvenile courts, there are always persons with strange appetites, whether these be judges or policemen or women. If such do not exist, they can be created by making available to them young girls or boys in the security of the jail or the detention home, and by appearing with flash cameras or witnesses, one becomes equipped with a whip adequate to direct all the future decisions of that person when these are needed. The handling of youth cases by courts should be led further and further away from law and further into, quote, mental problems, until the entire nation thinks of, quote, mental problems instead of criminals. This places vacancies everywhere in the courts, in the offices of district attorneys, on police staffs, which could then be filled with psychopolitical operators, and these become then the judges of the land by their influence, and into their hands comes the total control of the criminal, without whose help a revolution cannot ever be accomplished. By stressing this authority over the problems of youth and adults in court, one day the demand for psychopolitical operators could become such that even the armed services will use, quote, authorities on the mind, unquote, to work their various justices, and when this occurs, the armed forces of the nation then enter into our hands, as solidly as if we commanded them ourselves, with the slight bonus of having this, a skilled interrogator, near every technician or handler of secret war apparatus. The country, in event of revolution, as did Germany in 1918 and 1919, will find itself immobilized by its own army and navy, fully and entirely in communist hands. Thus, the subject of loyalties and their realignment is in fact the subject of non-armed conquest of an enemy. Chapter 6. The general subject of obedience. Obedience is the result of force. Everywhere we look on the history of Earth, we discover that obedience to new rulers has come about entirely through the demonstration on the part of those rulers of greater force than was to be discovered in the old ruler. A population overridden, conquered by war, is obedient to its conqueror. It is obedient to its conqueror because its conqueror has exhibited more force. Concurrent with force is brutality, for there are human considerations involved which also represent force. The most barbaric, unrestrained, brutal use of force, if carried far enough, invokes obedience. Savage force, sufficiently long displayed toward any individual, will bring about his concurrence with any principle or order. Force is the antithesis of humanizing actions. It is so synonymous in the human mind with savageness, lawlessness, brutality, and barbarism that it is only necessary to display an inhuman attitude toward people to be granted by those people the possession of force. Any organization which has the spirit and courage to display inhumanity, savageness, brutality, and an uncompromising lack of humanity will be obeyed. Such a use of force is itself the essential ingredient of greatness. We have to hand no less an example than our great communist leaders who, in moments of duress and trial, when faced by czarist rule, continued over the heads of an enslaved populace, yet displayed sufficient courage never to stay their hands of execution of the conversion of the Russian state to communist rule. If you would have obedience, you must have no compromise with humanity. If you would have obedience, you must make it clearly understood that you have no mercy. Man is an animal. He understands, in the final analysis, only those things which a brute understands. As an example of this, we find an individual refusing to obey and being struck. His refusal to obey is now less vociferous. He is struck again, and his resistance is lessened once more. He is hammered and pounded again and again until at length his only thought is direct and implicit obedience to that person from whom the force has emanated. This is a proven principle. It is proven because it is the main principle man, the animal, has used since his earliest beginnings. It is the only principle which has been effective, the only principle which has brought about a wide and continued belief. For it is to our benefit that an individual who is struck again and again and again from a certain source will, at length, hypnotically believe anything he is told by the source of the blows. The stupidity of Western civilizations is best demonstrated by the fact that they believe hypnotism is a thing of the mind, of attention, and a desire for unconsciousness. This is not true. Only when a person has been beaten, punished, and mercilessly hammered can hypnotism be guaranteed in its effectiveness. It is stated by Western authorities on hypnosis that only some 20% of the people are susceptible to hypnotism. This statement is very untrue. Given enough punishment, all of the people in any time and place are susceptible to hypnotism. In other words, by adding force, hypnotism is made uniformly effective. Where unconsciousness could not be induced by simple concentration upon the hypnotist, unconsciousness can be induced by drugs, by blows, by electric shock, and by other means. And where unconsciousness cannot be induced so as to make an implantation or an hypnotic command effective, it is only necessary to amputate the functioning portions of the animal man's brain to render him null and void and no longer a menace. Thus we find that hypnotism is entirely effective. The mechanisms of hypnotism demonstrate clearly that people can be made to believe in certain conditions and even in their environment or in politics by the administration of force. Thus it is necessary for a psychopolitician to be an expert in the administration of forces. Thus he can bring about implicit obedience not only on the part of individual members of the populace, but on the entire populace itself and its government. He needs only take unto himself a sufficiently savage role, a sufficiently uncompromising and human attitude, and he will be obeyed and believed. The subject of hypnotism is a subject of belief. What can people be made to believe? They can be made to believe anything which is administered to them with sufficient brutality and force. The obedience of a populace is as good as they will believe. Despicable religions, such as Christianity, knew this. They knew that if enough faith could be brought into being, a populace could be enslaved by the Christian mockeries of humanity and mercy, and thus could be disarmed. But one need not count upon this act of faith to bring about a broad belief. One must only exhibit enough force, enough inhumanity, enough brutality and savageness to create implicit belief, and therefore and thereby implicit obedience. As communism is a matter of belief, its study is a study of force. The earliest Russian psychiatrists pioneering this science of psychiatry understood thoroughly that hypnosis is induced by acute fear. They discovered it could also be induced by shock of an emotional nature, and also by extreme privation, as well as by blows and drugs. In order to induce a high state of hypnagogy in an individual, a group, or a population, an element of terror must always be present on the part of those who would govern. The psychiatrist is aptly suited to this role, for his brutalities are committed in the name of science are inexplicably complex. His brutalities are committed in the name of science and are inexplicably complex, and entirely out of view of the human understanding. A sufficient popular terror of the psychiatrist will, in itself, bring about insanity on the part of many individuals. A psychopolitical operative can then, entirely cloaked with authority, commence and continue a campaign of propaganda, describing various treatments which are administered to the insane. A psychopolitical operative should at all times insist that these treatments are therapeutic and necessary. He can, in all of his literature and his books, list large numbers of pretended cures by these means, but these cures need not produce any recovery from a state of disturbance. As long as the psychopolitical operative or his drugs are the only authority as to the difference between sanity and insanity, their word as to the therapeutic value of such treatment will be the final word. No layman would dare adventure to place judgment on the state of sanity of an individual whom the psychiatrist has already declared insane. The individual himself is unable to complain, and his family, as will be covered later, is already discredited by the occurrence of insanity in their midst. There must be no other adjudicators of insanity, otherwise it could be disclosed that the brutalities practiced in the name of treatment are not therapeutic. A psychopolitical operative has no interest in therapeutic means or cures. The greater number of insane in the country where he is operating, the larger number of the populace will come under his view, and the greater will become his facilities. Because the problem is apparently mounting into uncontrollable heights, he can more and more operate in an atmosphere of emergency, which again excuses his use of such treatments as electric shock, the prefrontal lobotomy, transorbital leucotomy, and other operations long since practiced in Russia on political prisoners. It is to the interest of the psychopolitical operative that the possibility of curing the insane be outlawed and ruled out at all times. For the sake of obedience on the part of the population and their general reaction, a level of brutality must, at all costs, be maintained. Only in this way Only in this way can the absolute judgment of the psychopolitical operative Only in this way can the absolute judgment of the psychopolitical operative as to the sanity or insanity of public figures be maintained in complete belief. Using sufficient brutality upon their patients, the public at large will come to believe utterly anything they say about their patients. Furthermore, and much more important, the field of the mind must be sufficiently dominated by the political operative so that wherever tenets of the mind are taught, they will be hypnotically believed. The psychopolitical operative, having under his control all psychology classes in an area, can thus bring about a complete reformation of the future leaders of a country in their educational processes, and so prepare them for communism. To be obeyed, one must be believed. If one is sufficiently believed, one will unquestioningly be obeyed. When he is fortunate enough to obtain into his hands anyone near to a political or important figure, this factor of obedience becomes very important. A certain amount of fear or terror must be engendered in the person under treatment, so that this person will then take immediate orders, completely and unquestioningly, from the psychopolitical operative, and so be able to influence the actions of that person who is to be reached. Bringing about this state of mind on the part of a populace and its leaders, that a psychopolitical operative must at all times be believed, could eventually be attended by very good fortune. It is not too much to hope that psychopolitical operatives would then, in a country such as the United States, become the most intimate advisors to political figures, even to the point of advising the entirety of a political party as to its actions in an election. The long view is the important view. Belief is engendered by a certain amount of fear and terror from an authoritative level, and this will be followed by obedience. The general propaganda which would best serve psychopolitics would be a continual insistence that certain authoritative levels of healing deemed this or that the correct treatment of insanity. These treatments must always include a certain amount of brutality. Propaganda should continue and stress the rising incidence of insanity in a country. The entire field of human behavior, for the benefit of the country, can, at length, be broadened into abnormal behavior. Thus, anyone indulging in any eccentricity, particularly the eccentricity of combating psychopolitics, could be silenced by the authoritative opinion on the part of a psychopolitical operative that he was acting in an abnormal fashion.